Nazis helped the US reach the moon. I've spent weeks digging into this so I can answer why. I also want to tell you how the US kept it hidden for so long, and why they couldn't just have used American scientists. After Germany lost World War II, the country was split up by the four winners: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. At first, the Allies focused on getting rid of the German military and punishing Nazi leaders for their war crimes. But over time, Germans wanted a united, functioning country again, and the US and Britain wanted to rebuild Germany's economy, partly to stop communism from spreading. So, in 1947, the US and Britain merged their zones into one. They called it Bizonia. France joined in a bit later, creating Trizonia, which would become West Germany. But the Soviet Union had other plans. They kept tight control over the eastern part of Germany, and eventually turned it into East Germany, under communist rule. The country stayed divided and weak. What rose instead were two global superpowers, USA and the USSR. Both sides wanted to prove theirs was better. But here's the thing, by now both sides had nuclear weapons, so if they went to war, the world could literally end. But in 1957, the Soviets suddenly launched Sputnik.
Today, a new moon is in the sky.
The first satellite ever sent into orbit. The US was shocked.
A 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
Suddenly, the Soviets were winning, and this was a massive warning to America that if they didn't do something, they would get left far behind, and they would likely lose in space. So President Dwight Eisenhower responded by creating NASA in 1958. America had to catch up fast. But building a space program from scratch is hard. The US was already way behind, meanwhile the Soviets were launching animals and soon even people into space. And this is where things get dark. A German rocket scientist named Wernher von Braun knew that the US needed something to boost the space program. And back in Nazi Germany, he had built the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile. It had been used to bomb cities like London. He was Hitler's top rocket guy, and a Nazi. Braun knew his knowledge would be very useful to the US. So he went to the American army and was basically like, look, I can build rockets that reach space. I just need a deal. Just maybe ignore my past and I'll help you beat the Soviets. And the Americans agreed. They knew the Soviets were also hunting for Nazi scientists, and if they got von Braun first, it could tilt the balance of power in the Cold War. So Braun surrendered to the Americans along with his entire rocket team, and instead of putting him on trial, von Braun would work for America's rocket program in exchange for his freedom. To be clear, this guy had worked for the Nazis. His rockets were built using forced labor from concentration camps, but he was also a genius, and the US needed geniuses if it wanted to beat the Soviets to space. His V-2 rockets were assembled by thousands of workers who died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or even execution. Some of these people building those rockets were prisoners who hadn't eaten in days, collapsing from exhaustion. Von Braun had visited the rocket build site regularly. He knew what was happening, and he kept the rockets coming. NASA knew this, and they also knew that the public wouldn't be thrilled if they hired former Nazis. So the US made a decision to smuggle them into America, and they took in around 1,600 Nazis. These were men with valuable skills in rockets, chemistry, engineering, even biological warfare. And the US just wiped the records clean. The way it worked was simple. If a Nazi scientist had useful knowledge, especially knowledge that could help the US military or space program, intelligence officers would paperclip his file. A paperclip placed on the folder meant this one's a keeper. That file would then be edited, whitewashed, and rewritten to remove any mention of Nazi affiliations, SS membership, or war crimes. That's how the operation got its name, Operation Paperclip. But these weren't just engineers with questionable pasts. Many were full-blown war criminals. Some had tested chemical weapons on prisoners, others had used humans for medical experiments. So why didn't the US just rely on its own scientists? I mean, the USA already has several very clever people they could employ. Why bring Nazis, men who had served Hitler, into American labs and eventually NASA? The truth is, America wasn't ready. By the end of the war, the US had brilliant engineers, sure, but not the kind who had spent years building long-range rockets. That kind of expertise didn't exist in the US. The Germans, on the other hand, had already launched the world's first ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket, and it was powered by technology decades ahead of anything the Americans had. To the US military and intelligence agencies, it was simple. If they didn't get von Braun and his team, the Soviets would, and that was a potential catastrophe. So von Braun and his team were moved to a military base in Huntsville, Alabama, where they worked on missiles for the US Army. They were tasked with building defense systems, but behind the scenes, von Braun had a different plan. He was thinking about space, but he was just waiting for the perfect moment. And then, Sputnik. And this was the moment von Braun had been waiting for. He had been pitching space travel for years, writing papers, sketching designs, showing up in Disney documentaries, explaining how we could get to the moon. Now suddenly this wasn't just science fiction anymore. In 1960, the US government officially moved von Braun and his team from the army to a brand new agency, NASA. In the beginning, von Braun wasn't responsible for the moon landing yet, since America didn't even want to send people there. But things were about to change. Millions of Americans believed the moon would be the finish line of the space race. So they elected John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is a bit skeptical of this space exploration thing at first. But after the Soviet successes, he decided that he will take space exploration seriously. I mean, take a look at this speech.
The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it.
So the new president poured billions of dollars into the space program. NASA's budget grew by 400% compared to previous years, and Braun is tasked with the impossible. His mission was to put a man on the moon. He was appointed director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and given the green light to build something he had never built before. A rocket big enough, powerful enough, and reliable enough to take humans 250,000 miles into space and bring them back home alive. That rocket was the Saturn V, taller than even the Statue of Liberty, with more thrust than 30 jumbo jets. It was a monster. Von Braun oversaw it all, and then in 1969, after 9 years of preparations, Apollo 11 lifts off, Saturn V roars to life, and the world watches. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong takes that first step onto the moon.
One giant leap for mankind.
And the US wins the space race, and Kennedy's promise to land people on the moon by the end of the decade is fulfilled. But here's where things get wild. Most Americans had no idea who the man behind the moon landing really was. Wernher von Braun, this smiling charismatic scientist on TV, was everywhere. He gave interviews, showed up in documentaries, shook hands with presidents, but almost no one knew his past, because the US government had done a very good job of hiding it. He wasn't the man who worked for Hitler anymore. He was Dr. von Braun, American rocket pioneer. The moon landing was one of the most incredible things humans have ever done. A rocket taller than a skyscraper launched into space, landed on another world, and came back. But the truth is, that rocket was built on a foundation of silence. Wernher von Braun never faced consequences. He died a celebrated American hero. And today, most people still don't know the full story. That's the uncomfortable part of history. Sometimes it moves forward, carried by the people we'd rather forget.